Nobody warns you that the worst 2 seconds of your life can also be the first 2 seconds of something that changes everything. And Daniel Hayes learned that lesson standing frozen in a hallway in Portland with his hand still on a half-open door. He would replay those 2 seconds 100 times before the night was over, but not for the reason he expected, because what happened next had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with a request he never saw coming. Daniel had been splitting rent with Claire Whitman for almost 14 months, ever since a mutual friend connected two strangers who both needed a cheaper place near downtown. Claire worked long hours at a marketing firm, the kind of job that ate weekends and swallowed evenings whole, and Daniel had grown used to a quiet apartment that mostly felt like two separate lives orbiting the same kitchen. They were polite. They were friendly in the way roommates learn to be friendly, trading grocery reminders and half-finished conversations about whose turn it was to take out the trash. Nothing more, nothing less. That Thursday had been brutal. Rain hammered the windows of the old brick building the way it only does in the Pacific Northwest, relentless and gray and endless, and Daniel had spent 11 hours on his feet at the warehouse before finally dragging himself up 3 flights of stairs. The apartment felt different that night, unusually silent, the kind of silence that makes you notice every small sound. He assumed Claire was out, maybe at one of her work dinners, so when he walked past her bedroom and saw the door sitting slightly ajar, he didn't think twice about glancing toward the gap. For one full second, his brain simply refused to process what his eyes were showing him. Claire was standing in front of her mirror halfway through changing out of her work clothes, and in the split moment before he could look away, she turned and saw him standing there. Her eyes went wide. His face went red. Neither of them said a word for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a heartbeat. "I'm so sorry," Daniel blurted, already spinning toward the kitchen like the floor had caught fire beneath him. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't want to see her expression, didn't want to know if it was anger or disgust or something worse, so he just kept walking until he reached the sink, gripping the edge of the counter like it could somehow anchor him back to a version of the evening where none of this had happened. His heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the 11 hours he had just worked. He poured a glass of water he had no intention of drinking and stared at it, replaying the 2 seconds over and over, searching for some alternate version of events where he had simply kept walking past that door. There wasn't one. It had happened, and now he had absolutely no idea what came next. He expected shouting, he expected her to slam a door, or worse, to pack a bag right there and leave, or to call the friend who had introduced them and demand an explanation for the stranger she'd been living with for over a year. What he did not expect, 4 long minutes later, was a soft knock on his own bedroom door. Daniel froze with the glass still in his hand. He set it down slowly, wiped his palms on his jeans, and opened the door, bracing for the worst version of this conversation. Claire stood in the hallway wearing a change of clothes now, her hair pulled back, and instead of the anger he had rehearsed a dozen apologies for, she wore something closer to a tired, almost amused smile. "Hey," she said, her voice steady in a way that completely threw him off balance. "I actually need your help with something." For a moment, Daniel just stared at her, certain he had misheard. He had spent the last 4 minutes preparing for eviction, not a favor. "You need my help," he repeated slowly, like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. "With what exactly?" Claire didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and walked toward the living room, glancing back once to make sure he was following, which he was, mostly because his legs seemed to be moving on autopilot while his brain was still stuck 4 minutes in the past. What he found in the living room stopped him in the doorway. It wasn't outfits scattered across the couch cushions, the way he might have guessed if he'd had time to guess anything at all. It was folders, stacks of them, spread across the coffee table and half the couch, printed spreadsheets with red circles and yellow highlighter bleeding through the pages, a laptop open to an email thread with a subject line he could read from 6 feet away. Final notice. Response required by Friday. Claire dropped onto the couch and rubbed both hands over her face before looking up at him. "I got laid off 2 weeks ago," she said. "I haven't told anyone yet. Not my parents, not my friends, nobody. I've been leaving the apartment every morning like I still have a job, sitting in coffee shops filling out applications so you wouldn't figure it out." Daniel's stomach dropped somewhere near his shoes. All those months of comfortable, distant politeness suddenly felt like they had been hiding something enormous, something Claire had been carrying entirely alone just a few feet down the same hallway. "Claire, why didn't you say anything?" he asked quietly, sitting down across from her without thinking about it. I didn't know how, she admitted. Everyone thinks I have it together. My parents already worry I moved too far from home. I couldn't handle them finding out I failed at the one thing I was supposed to be good at. She gestured at the folders. There's a small business grant program downtown. I've been trying to put together a pitch to start something on my own, a freelance consulting thing. Instead of going back to another company that'll burn me out the same way, the application closes Friday at noon. I have the numbers. I have the plan. What I don't have is anyone to sit across from me and tell me if I sound like I actually believe in it, because right now I don't even know anymore. The rain kept beating against the window as Daniel looked at the mess of paperwork, the crossed-out sentences, the exhaustion written across a face that had always seemed so composed over morning coffee. Whatever awkwardness had followed him down that hallway 10 minutes earlier had completely dissolved, replaced by something that felt far more urgent. "Walk me through it," he said. "All of it. Start over, like I know nothing, because I basically don't." What followed was nothing like the evening either of them had planned. Claire ran through her pitch 3 times, then 5, then Daniel started interrupting with questions a skeptical grant committee might actually ask, pushing her to defend numbers she had barely looked at twice. Somewhere around midnight, they were no longer just roommates trading polite hallway greetings. They were 2 people hunched over a coffee table covered in coffee rings, rebuilding a plan from the ground up. He caught a gap in her financial projections that would have sunk the whole pitch in the first 5 minutes. She rewrote 3 slides while he read them back to her out loud, flagging every sentence that sounded rehearsed instead of real. Somewhere in the middle of it all, she finally told him the rest, how her father had once told her that leaving her hometown for a job in advertising was a mistake, how some small stubborn part of her had spent 14 months trying to prove him wrong to an apartment full of silence instead of to anyone who was actually listening. Daniel told her about his own detour, the warehouse job that was never supposed to last this long, the associate's degree he kept meaning to finish, the way pride sometimes convinces you that admitting you're struggling is worse than actually struggling. By 2 in the morning, the folders were organized into a clean stack. The laptop screen glowed with a document titled Final Draft, and Claire was laughing for the first time all night, the exhausted kind of laugh that comes right before relief. "I actually think this is good," she said, staring at the screen like she barely recognized her own work. "I know it's good," Daniel said. "You just needed someone to say it out loud." She looked at him then, really looked, the same way she had in that split second in her bedroom doorway, except this time neither of them looked away. "Thank you," she said, "not just for tonight, for not walking away 4 minutes ago." He smiled, still a little embarrassed, still a little amazed at how the worst moment of his week had somehow led here. "I almost did," he admitted. "I stood in the kitchen for a solid 4 minutes convincing myself you were about to move out." "I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds, she said, grinning. "Then I remembered you're the only person in this building who knows how to fix a jam garbage disposal, so I figured I'd keep you around." Friday came fast. Claire submitted the application at 11:40, 20 minutes before the deadline, her hands shaking slightly as she hit send while Daniel stood behind her in the kitchen pretending not to watch. Then came the waiting, 10 days that stretched painfully slow, filled with the kind of forced small talk that couldn't quite hide how much they both actually cared about the outcome now. On the 10th day, Daniel came home from the warehouse to find the apartment unusually loud for once, music playing, the smell of something actually cooking instead of takeout containers on the counter. Claire spun around before he'd even closed the door, holding up her phone with an email open on the screen, the subject line impossible to miss even from across the room. "Congratulations, your application has been approved." She didn't say a word, just crossed the kitchen and hugged him, the kind of hug that comes from somewhere deeper than gratitude for a single favor. They celebrated that night with cheap takeout and a bottle of wine neither of them could really afford, laughing about the absurd start to the whole thing, the accidental glance through a half-open door that had somehow cracked open something far more important than either of them expected. Months later, Claire's small consulting business had 2 other freelancers working under her, the folders replaced by a proper office setup in the corner of the living room, and the silence that used to fill the apartment had been replaced by something closer to an actual home. Daniel finally re-enrolled to finish his degree, partly because watching someone rebuild an entire future from a coffee table full of paperwork made his own excuses feel a lot smaller. The awkward 2 seconds in that hallway never really came up again, not directly, though sometimes Claire would tease him about it when he forgot to knock before walking into a room. What neither of them ever forgot was the 4 minutes that followed, the knock on his door, and the 6 words that turned one uncomfortable evening into the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, standing frozen on opposite sides of a half-open door.